Welcome to this virtual tour of the exhibition Adopt an Artwork, an exhibition of work from the permanent collection at Riverbrink Art Museum. My name is Debra Antoncic and I'm the Director Curator at Riverbrink. This exhibition is also a fundraiser. We're encouraging members of the community to support the Art Museum by adopting an artwork for 1 year or longer. It's a way of supporting the Art Museum and establishing a strong connection to perhaps a beloved work of art. Although the adopted works remain at Riverbrink, you may choose to one of 5 different giving levels, starting at just $50. Your adoption helps support ongoing care and conservation of artworks and helps ensure the future of the collection. When you adopt an artwork, your name will be shown on the label whenever the work is exhibited, but you can also remain anonymous if you prefer. Adopting an artwork is also a wonderful memorial tribute for an art lover and Riverbrink supporter. Tax receipts are provided for donations. For today's virtual tour, I've selected a few artworks in this exhibition, in this fundraiser, to discuss in greater depth, to provide more information and insights into these much loved artworks. So beginning with this work by Cornelius Krieghoff, Settlers' Cabin in the Foothills, otherwise also called Early Canadian Settler in some of our documents. It dates to 1859. The scene is really quintessential Krieghoff, for those of you who know his work. We see a landscape with a cabin in a clearing. There's colorful foliage suggesting the fall season. And the scene conveys this settler ideal of homesteading in pre-Confederation Canada. Krieghoff was born in Amsterdam in 1815. Details of his early life are somewhat sketchy, but he apparently studied in Bavaria and Dusseldorf, learning to paint genre scenes, that is, scenes of everyday life, of taverns and peasants and comic figures, before he emigrated to North America in 1837. He lived for a time in the US and a decade later was married and living in Toronto. He had difficulty making a living in the city of Toronto or Montreal, but did find some success when he settled in Quebec City in the 1850s. As a painter from the Netherlands, Krieghoff was influenced by the work of other Netherlands artists such as Peter Bruegel, known for peasant scenes such as this one, The Harvesters from 1565. And you see, again, a typical landscape and then these small figures reclining after the harvest in a very easygoing and relaxed and pleasant scene of country life. Krieghoff began in a similar way with genre scenes, with figures in a landscape, both indigenous and habitants in Quebec, and then moved to pure landscape. The work is often reproduced in sequence, in series, different variations of a theme. And here I'm showing you clearing land near the St. Maurice River from 1860, which is in the Thompson collection at the AGO and is very similar to our Settlers' Cabin in the Foothills. So this is again characteristic of Krieghoff's work, that is, doing more than one variation on a theme. The date and the title suggest that it comes from the era of colonisation, Settlers' Cabin in the Foothills. This is a time when the government of Lower Canada opened up crown lands in Saguenay, in the St. Maurice River area, above Trois-Rivières and Ottawa, as well as in the eastern townships for colonization, for settlement. This was done to encourage people to stay in Quebec and farm at a time when many were moving to the US, to New England, to work in the mills, or to the American West. This land in Quebec was often marginal and difficult for farming. But here we don't see the hardship. We see a sunlit path leading into a clearing toward the cabin, nestled under the trees. And one of the attractions of Krieghoff's work is these lovely details. So we have a figure seated in the cabin door, a small child, a puppy, and some chickens. Other details, a cow, a man chopping down wood, someone getting water. So these wonderful little details within the larger canvas draw our eye in and draw our attention to the scene. Sam Weir purchased the painting in 1958 in Toronto, and he described it as an addition to his collection of Canadian paintings that he intended would one day go to a museum. A decade later, when he purchased this work in 1967 by an unknown artist titled The Battle of Queenston Heights, his idea for Riverbrink was more fully formed. He had more definitive plans for an art gallery or an art museum, or sometimes he referred to it as a museum of Canadiana. This particular painting, purchased in 1967, is one example of the founder's interest in Canadian history, but also how the location of Riverbrink, here on the Niagara River, played a role in building the collection. The painting was listed as attributed to Major James Dennis when first accessioned into the collection in 1983. Art historians use this term to indicate a best guess as to the artist. Over the years, this attributed to was used less frequently, such that now we often hear this referred to as the Dennis painting. But the link to James Dennis, Captain James Dennis, that is, with the Grenadier Company of the 49th Foot defending the village of Queenston from the invasion from the US on the morning of October 13th, 1812, is tenuous at best. It's likely the product of wishful thinking, with perhaps a dash of embellishment from an enterprising London art dealer. Weir purchased this painting in 1967 from Richard Green Fine Paintings, London, England. The painting had been advertised for sale in Antiques magazine in June of 1967 with a nice photograph, but no details of provenance or attribution. Weir described the painting in a letter to the dealer as not a fine art effort, perhaps an acknowledgement of the naive quality of the perspective. But the handling of the oil paint is very professional. It's clearly by a skilled artist, and because no other paintings by Major Dennis have come to light, we now discount the attribution and list it as by an unknown artist. It seems likely that Green did some research after he acquired the painting, found this print, also titled Battle of Queenston Heights, in a bound volume of prints. The information indicates it was drawn by James Dennis and engraved by Thomas Sutherland, and Green likely made the assumption that the print was taken after the painting, completed from the painting, and therefore assigned authorship to Dennis. One of Sam Weir's colleagues in London described Green as, quote, new to the business and rather flamboyant, a description suggesting less than confidence on what the dealer had to say. Producing a print after a painting is the more typical sequence. Popular paintings were often copied, that is, reproduced for sale as engravings. This was a popular and lucrative business for artists, engravers, and publishers in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Green's assumption was that this oil painting was also copied and disseminated as a print. But I propose an alternative, that the scene was first created as a print based on a sketch by James Dennis, engraved by Thomas Sutherland, and then the painting was done later, after the print, and not by James Dennis. One of the intriguing aspects of the painting is that the events of the day have been combined into one scene. The scene opens at 4 a.m. on October 13th, 1812, when US American forces launched an amphibious assault across the Niagara River. The 13th Infantry, under the leadership of Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, was supported by artillery at Lewiston and Fort Grey, the original staging areas for the invasion. At 5 a.m., the British fire from the landing at Queenston. Captain James Dennis, with the Grenadier Company of the 49th Foot, defends the village, while Captain John Williams, with the Light Company of the 49th Foot, attempts to keep the American infantry from securing the Redan, a crescent-shaped fortification above on the heights. By 6:30, the Americans have taken the heights south of Queenston, and fierce fighting ensues as the Americans gain a foothold on the village. They land more troops north of the village at Hamilton Cove, forcing a wounded Captain Dennis to withdraw his forces to Vrooman's Point. By 7:30 a.m., Major General Sir Isaac Brock arrives in Queenston, assesses the situation, and his officers decide to retake the Redan with a full frontal assault. Brock assembles a force of regulars and militia who march up the hill in formation. Brock is shot, perhaps by a sniper, on the heights, and is thought to have been killed instantly. In the afternoon, the action occurs off-scene. At approximately 3 p.m., Major General Roger Hale Scaife arrives from south of the heights with a force of regulars, militia, and Grand River warriors under the leadership of John Norton. The Americans retreat to the Niagara River, but are forced to surrender, trapped between Scaife and the artillery and the Light Company of the Foot. The idea of an eyewitness account, an eyewitness rendering, is very compelling. But the loss of this direct link does not detract from the painting, and it remains a much-loved work in the Weir collection at Riverbrink. Moving into the next room, next up we'll look at Jacob Epstein's Marigolds. So as you can see from this brief sampling, the collection has some very important Canadian works, and then also several European artists are well represented. Here we have Sir Jacob Epstein's Marigolds. Epstein was an American-British sculptor, a somewhat controversial pioneer of modern sculpture, and his sources include the artistic traditions borrowed, or today we might say appropriated, from Africa and Asia and Polynesia. Epstein was born in the United States and moved to Europe in 1902, becoming a British subject in 1913. He often produced controversial works, particularly in sculpture, work that challenged ideas about what would be appropriate subject matter for public sculpture. Among the most controversial were these figures on the facade of the British Medical Association building in London, completed in 1908. These were life-sized figures, or over life-size figures, filling 18 niches high up on the facade, and the figures represented different stages in the lives of man and woman. They were too graphic for contemporary taste, and eventually suffered considerable damage under acid rain, with various details of the figures having to be removed because a piece fell off. So out of concern for safety, the figures were scaled back, but these remnants remain on the building today. The Weir collection includes many sculptural works by Epstein, including portrait heads of Winston Churchill and George Bernard Shaw, as I'm showing here, and a drawing, in addition to this gouache Marigolds. Flowers and floral nature studies were an unusual subject for Epstein, but he embarked on this genre of paintings with energy in the 1930s. He was commissioned by a Dutch firm, dealers in old master paintings, to produce flower studies. Epstein rented a cottage in Epping Forest in Essex and began what he described in his autobiography as a frenzy of painting. Epping Forest was an ancient woodland, a large tract of uncultivated land in the northeast of London. It had long held a fascination for Epstein. Since 1922, he had rented a number of properties in the area as a retreat from the bustle and diversions of London. I said I would paint 20, Epstein later recalled in his autobiography, and in the end, I painted 60. Not content with this, I went on painting, giving up sculpture for the time being and painting 300 more. I lived and painted flowers. My rooms were piled with flowers, and this was a wonderful and colorful period, end quote. The painting spree continued even after his return to London. His patrons, delighted with his work, sent Epstein crates of flowers, fresh cut flowers by air freight, and this continued until the outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939. There is this wonderful energy and movement that is also present in his sculptures that I think we can see in this gouache, the yellow and orange against the blue and green, and this all over composition. And it's quite unexpected and very dynamic, particularly for those who are familiar more with Epstein's sculpture. Moving on to the next work, we have for adoption, William Glackins' Washington Square, again with no secure date. But Washington Square is a landmark in the Manhattan neighborhood of Greenwich Village in New York. There was a large memorial arch of plaster and wood constructed on what had been a parade ground in 1889 to celebrate the centennial of President George Washington's inauguration. The temporary arch was so popular that in 1892, a permanent marble arch designed by architect Stanford White was erected. Prior to the construction of the arch, the area had a darker history, one that is particularly poignant in this year of the pandemic. In the early 19th century, the open space was used as a public burial ground, in part for victims of an epidemic of yellow fever. Later in the 19th century, the streets around the square became one of the fashionable addresses in New York. The square and arch were favorite subjects for artist William Glackins, who completed more than 20 paintings of the square between 1909 and 1914. The Philadelphia-born artist painted the view from his studio on the south edge of the park. Next up we have Sur la rive du lac, Le Soir by Jean-Charles Cazin, French artist, born at Samer, Pas-de-Calais. After studying painting first in France, Cazin traveled to England, where he was strongly influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and many of his important earlier pictures have a religious theme involving stories and figures from the Old and New Testament. His work gradually became less realist idealist as he moved to explore different treatments of landscape. He worked later in a mode known as tonalism. And here I'm showing a very quintessential tonalist painting by James Abbott, Mcneil Whistler, Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket from 1875. An artistic style that emerged in the 1880s, emphasizing mood and shadow, tonalism was popular among American painters, followers of Whistler, who began to paint landscape forms from an overall tone of colored atmosphere or mist. Between 1880 and 1915, these dark, neutral tones such as gray and brown or blue often dominated compositions by artists associated with tonalism. During the late 1890s, American art critics began to use the term tonal to describe these works. Like Impressionism, it derived from the Barbizon school of landscape painting, but tonalism was eclipsed by the popularity of Impressionism by the end of the century. Our painting is undated, but would appear to belong to this later period. There are these wonderful indistinct shapes, buildings, shrouded in fog and mist with tiny points of light. The shore is indistinct, but we can just make out the shape of piers along the shore. The painting is one of several by French artists in the collection, including Impressionists Armand Guillaumin, Auguste Renoir, Mary Cassatt, and Edgar Degas. I've also included several sculptures, like such as this one by Marc-Aurèle Defoe-Suzor-Côté, La Campagne du Vieux Pionnier from 1914 in bronze. Suzor trained as a painter, but he began to experiment with bronze figures in the early 1900s while living and working in Paris. He first created small bronze figures to work out the composition while working on a competition for the Legislative Assembly of Quebec, which was to be a history painting showing the death of Montcalm in 1759 at the Battle of Quebec. The companion it's a companion portrait to Le Vieux Pionnier from 1912. Similar subjects were explored by other artists around this time, a vision of rural Quebec at a time of increasing urbanization in the early 20th century. This interest may have been to define, in part to define a culture and a society as a point of contrast, that is the past from the present, or perhaps an expression of anti-modernism, a rejection of the effects of modernization, a nostalgia for the past, for a disappearing way of life and people. We can see in this work these wonderful details, the floorboards, the shoes, the clothing, the cap, and the knitting needles and the ball of yarn, an activity that some of us have taken up during the pandemic. The companion is also a pioneer. She likely raised a family and lived a life of hard physical labor, and even in old age keeps busy with her knitting. And last, we'll look at this lovely portrait by Frances Coates, titled Portrait of Francis Davis from 1760. Frances Coates was an English painter, one of the pioneers of English pastel painting, and a founding member of the British Royal Academy in 1768. He was born in London, the son of an apothecary, and trained with portrait painter George Knapton before setting up his own business. His exposure to his father's livelihood was helpful in his study for the making of pastels. He became one of the pioneers of pastel portraiture in Britain. He was very popular and prolific, one of the most fashionable choices for a portrait done in pastel at the time. He initially concentrated on pastel, but turned to oil in order to develop larger scale canvases and work more quickly on a larger scale. But he successfully imitated his skill with pastel in thinly applied oil. His portraits of fashionable ladies and gentlemen are imbued with charm, inviting comparisons with Allan Ramsay and Sir Joshua Reynolds, his contemporaries. As we see in this oil, his work has a certain warmth and displays a remarkable attention to costume. We don't have any details of the sitter, Francis Davis, nor do we know why Weir was interested in acquiring this particular portrait. The collection includes many portraits and paintings and prints, so it was definitely a subject that interested him. The sitter is pensive. She looks directly at the viewer, her face resting on her palm, leaning on the arm of a green-colored chair or sofa. The background is dark, which sets off the pink of her dress and her pale skin. And we have these wonderful details of the lace at her cuffs, which are carefully laid out as if to emphasize the artist's skill in rendering. And a wonderful, wonderful depiction of fabric, of the lace, and the different contrasting fabric between what might be silk and then the mat of the chair. You can find details of the adoption program, details for this painting and all the others that we've discussed in this program. And I thank you for joining on the tour today. You can find details on our website, and I look forward to seeing you at some point in the gallery to view these lovely works in person. Thank you.